Let's jump into our topic this evening. So tonight, the topic is truth dead? We're going to be asking the question, what would the world be like without truth? How important is truth? And in our world, we're seeing an unprecedented amount of uncertainty. And I want to explore some of those areas in our lives that we are bombarded with this uncertainty. First area is uncertainty in our climate, climatic uncertainty. Just about every day when you turn on the news, if you watch the news, or whether it be your neighbor that tells you somehow, it seems like just about every time we turn around, we have another natural disaster, another catastrophe, another drought, a fire, a tornado. And that's not just because we're paying more attention. In fact, I don't know if we all are. We may or may not be. But it's pretty hard to avoid. You can see this is a chart showing for the last, maybe 50 years, a little bit more, about 60 years on that chart. And it's showing that there is a massive increase, exponential increase of natural disasters. This is showing from the year 1952 to the year 2009. And I'm pretty sure that we can be confident that that trajectory just continues onward up until the day we are in right now. Earthquakes, hurricanes, all of these things are creating a sense of uncertainty, right? We can't expect that the weather is going to be the same today as it was yesterday, and that it's going to be tomorrow. In fact, our lives could be completely undone in a single moment. You know, there's a fault line that runs right through here. You're probably familiar with that, but that right there, if that fault line ends up, and they're expecting at any moment, if it gives way, we could have our lives completely changed right here in our little part of the world. Tornadoes are constantly coming through. All of these things create a certain sense of uncertainty. We're also facing financial uncertainty. With the debt, what we're seeing in the United States, this is also unprecedented. We've never seen I don't know of any country that has ever seen, I'm sure there's never been numbers like this. I checked it today. We are $20 billion in debt. And you can go online and you can look up the debt clock. It's this massive number, and it's just racing upward. And that's just our debt. There's also what they call a gap, of the amount that people, or basically IOUs that the government has to its citizens, within the citizens. So that would be our retirement funds, that would be our health care and things like that. There would be different areas in there, and we're massively more in debt than the $20 billion that we see. So that creates uncertainty. At any moment, this bubble, this unreal currency that is not based on anything other than somebody deciding, let's print this much and let's burn this much and let's do this. There's no basis on which the financial system is built upon, which leaves us with a sense of uncertainty. Any moment, the thing that we depend on, this currency that we're using on a daily basis, could just simply vanish, and we would be left completely vulnerable. Not only do we see uncertainty there, but we also see a lot of biological uncertainty. What am I talking about there? People aren't sure if they are male or female. This one wasn't a big head scratcher for thousands of years, and yet somehow in the last couple of decades we've had, and even more recently in maybe the last 5 or 6 years, we've had a massive increase of people that are confused on the topic of whether or not they are male or female, or rather, on a biological fact, they are confused. You can see a couple of the Time magazine article, or not article, but the the front page. We can also see on the National Geographic, looking at this topic, and of course with the whole controversy of the different bathrooms that they're trying to set up, and whether or not they're going to create a third bathroom, or which bathroom they're going to go into, and the whole controversy there. We can see also there's historical uncertainty. People are going back and or reinventing what took place in history, leaving out parts, adding other parts, and they're doing it very deliberately. This isn't just something they're doing unconsciously. This is something they're deliberately going back into history and trying to edit out the parts that they don't like. There was a book written on this topic in 1991 by Catherine Millard, and basically she undertakes the challenge to describe how the history of America has been reinterpreted and rewritten by secularists and humanists, historians, who have systematically excluded much that relates to faith in God from their accounts. So basically, they're trying to go back to the beginning of the United States and throughout the history of the United States, and they're trying to remove anything that had to do with faith, with God, and create a secular history. We see uncertainty in our political world. Massive uncertainty here. And I thought it was very interesting back in the run between, the Republicans and the Democrats back in, 2015, that they were beginning this run, right? We had 16 people on the Republican side, some 16, and there was maybe 3 on the Democratic side, and they're running for the finish line. And at one point, I remember I think I was watching Fox News, and they were talking about the different polls that were coming out, every week or so. They would have a new poll figuring out who's ahead in this race. And it was very interesting because there was 2 different polls that they talked about, one right after the other. In the first poll, they looked at the question of who out of all of the candidates was the most honest. And does anybody want to venture a guess at who was the lowest on the totem pole as far as honesty went on the Democratic side? We'll start with the Democrats. Any ideas? Go ahead. Yeah. Hillary Clinton was on the lowest of the lows as far, and not by just a small margin. It was like by a couple of dozen points. I think she was down in the 30s, and I think Sanders was up in the 80s, and then I think there was somebody else running. I don't remember his name right now. He was somewhere in the middle. So we had this massive difference between the trustworthiness of each one of these candidates. Now, going over to the Republican side, do you have any idea who was on the bottom of the totem pole? The Republicans, basically tied with Hillary. Donald Trump. All right, so most untrustworthy candidates, we've got both of them massively less than all of the other candidates, and now they transitioned straight from that poll to then talk about the popularity poll. And do you have any idea which candidate was which of each side of the candidates was on the very top of the popularity poll? Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. What does that tell us about our society? It tells us that we no longer value honesty. If we go back to Abe Lincoln, we all heard the stories growing up, or hopefully we did, the honest Abe that never told a lie, and all these ethics and this emphasis on honesty. If Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump had run for president back in the 50s or 40s or 30s, or pick any other decade in our history and have these 2 people run, I can guarantee you they would have both been at the very bottom of the popularity poll, because back then people valued honesty. They valued truth. So we see that this problem of truth or uncertainty or this confusion in our society is a systemic problem. It's a problem that applies across the board. We, as a nation, have left off the importance that we place on the topic of honesty and truth. And we can see this very plainly in fake news and what this new phenomenon of fake news. It's so easy to publish different news with social media and other avenues that people are posting not necessarily what's true, but whatever seems to help whatever thing they're trying to accomplish at the particular moment. We saw this all throughout the candidacy. We saw that they would release different truth. We saw even here in Iowa when it was time to do the voting. You guys might remember, Ben Carson was running for presidency, and we get to here in Iowa, we're the first ones to vote. And during that very night, we had a false rumor or a fake news about his dropping out of the race the very same night that everybody was voting. Do you guys remember that? Yeah, crazy thing. So they spread this fake news all around to all of the different areas and told them, vote for Ted. And so you saw that all throughout the candidacy, releasing different news that would help in the race towards the finish. And the amazing thing is no one seemed to care. It didn't seem to alarm anybody too much. People don't seem, so you can see, not only did we see dishonesty within the candidates, but you also saw the dishonesty in the media. So the media is there to try to inform us of what's really going on, right? Isn't that the whole point of the media, is to try to weed through the lies? But we saw that people distrusted. I mean, this was an interesting thing I looked at. A poll was taken right before the election, found that only 32% trusted the press. So you have some 30% that trust the candidate, and you have some 30% that trust the press. How are you going to figure out who's telling the truth? And in today and age, it's becoming more and more difficult because less and less people really care. We're going to look at that more tomorrow night. We could go on and on and on, and all of the uncertainties that we see in our society, relational uncertainty with, divorce rates at about 50%, and people aren't even getting married because it's a waste of time and all of these things. So the divorce rate is staying about the same, but the amount of people that are separating outside of marriage is greatly increasing as well. So we see people don't know how to be with people or who to be with, or there's relational uncertainty and confusion. And of course, moral confusion that we see all throughout our society and all throughout around the world with terrorism and crime, and all of these things leads us to ask the question, is truth dead? It's a serious question, and we're going to see just how serious it is. And it's a question that was not just asked here in this series, but just this April was asked by Time magazine. They put it on their front page. Is God, well, first of all, is truth dead? They asked this question. But if you can see, you might see a slight similarity between a cover page that they had some 51 years earlier. What did that cover page say? Is God dead? So, in fact, I read a little article on this, on the cover page of these two articles, and they said that the font that they had used to put on the cover page back 51 years ago had been discontinued. They weren't using that font anymore, so they hired somebody specifically to copy the same exact font that they used in that time, or to paint, basically, to create, with graphics, to create the exact same font so that people would unmistakably see that they were trying to show a connection here, asking the question, is God dead? Is truth dead? And I'm going to do my best to show you guys during this series that there is a correlation between these two questions. If God is dead, then truth necessarily is dead also. If God exists, truth exists also. So we need to ask the question whether or not God exists in order to find the answer of whether or not truth still exists. So let's go back to the start. Here we begin our journey. If we go back to the beginning, we're going to either find that there was God, we're going to find that in the beginning God, or we're going to go back and we're going to find that in the beginning nothing. And depending on which belief that you have about our origins will determine what we call a worldview. A worldview is the lens that we use to look at the rest of to interpret our world, to interpret every aspect of our lives. The worldview is built up of beliefs that we have, conscious and unconscious beliefs that we have that function as a filter to interpret all of the different aspects of our lives. And to illustrate the importance or the significance of a worldview, we need to meet George. So, meet George. George has a very strange problem. George thinks that he's dead. And this is a big problem because his wife is left living with somebody that believes that he is dead. And so you can imagine how inconvenient that would be. You know, okay, George, time to get out of bed. No. Why not? Because I'm dead. Okay. What do you say to that, right? Okay. All right, George, time to eat dinner. No, I'm dead. Okay, George. So all of these different home projects and different things are not being done. All of this is happening, and every time that she tries to get him to engage with something, he simply says, I can't because I'm dead. So she finally decides it's worth hiring a psychologist, and the psychologist comes in and begins to work with George, sits down with him and says, George, why do you think you're dead? He goes, I just believe that I am dead. The psychologist has never had a patient quite like this, so he decides he's going to have to think on this one. All night long, he thinks, what can he do to convince George that he's not dead? He finally has an aha moment, and he rushes back there the next day. He takes George down to the morgue. He's gotten permission. They go back and they pull out one of the dead bodies, like a real dead body. There it is. And, kind of a gruesome thing. They open up the pull back the sheet, and sure enough, pale, motionless, he begins to describe this dead body. Okay, George, notice what happens when I speak into his ear. He speaks into his ear. Nothing. Notice what happens when I pinch him. Nothing. Notice what happens. And he goes through this list of different things, and he goes, George, you want to know the best way to really know whether or not somebody is dead or alive? George says, okay, yeah, tell me, what is it? So he takes a little pin out of his that he has in his hand, and he pricks the finger of George. And he squeezes the finger of George, and nothing comes out. Absolutely nothing comes out. He goes, see, George? Do you see that? Dead people don't bleed. Oh, okay. He goes, okay, George, let me see your finger. Gets another pin, pricks his finger, squeezes his finger, and of course, it starts to bleed. And George goes, the psychologist goes, well, George, what did you learn today? George says, dead people do bleed. George's belief in the fact that he was dead was so strong that every single evidence to the contrary was interpreted through that already made up mind. Our worldview works the exact same way. All of the evidence to the contrary, whether massive or minute, everything is put through the filter of our worldview. So we need to understand what worldview we are using, and that brings us back to the question of where did we come from? Did we come from God or did we come from nothing? Because there is a worldview that believes that we came from nothing, we are here for no reason, we're going nowhere, and this worldview is called nihilism. Nihilism literally means in the Latin, nothing. So it's nothingness. Nihilism is the religion of nothingness. Basically what nihilism does is it labels all values as worthless, therefore nothing can be known or communicated. Stick with that for just 1 second. Nothing can be known or communicated. They believe in nothingness to such an extent that they don't believe that it's actually possible for me to communicate something to you in a way that you will understand what I am talking about. In fact, I had a very interesting conversation with somebody that believed that there was no truth, no absolute truth whatsoever. And after about a half an hour of talking with this person, we were talking over lunch, I finally, so frustrated, I exhausted all of the different arguments and all of the different avenues that I could use to finally try and convince this guy that there is something true. So I finally took a cup and I placed it on the table and I said, okay, I don't know, because he'd gotten into the molecular structure of everything and how there's really more nothing than something. And so I said, okay, let's bring it back. So I put the cup on the table and I said, tell me this. I don't know exactly what that is. I couldn't describe it scientifically or philosophically or anything, but tell me this. Does that cup exist? Whatever it is, does it exist? And he looked me straight in the eyes and he said, no. And I didn't know what to say. And all of a sudden I had this sinking feeling inside because I realized how lonely that must be. To live in a world where you can't communicate, where I had gone through this journey with him and I had seen that he didn't believe that the feelings that I'm feeling, the feelings of love and joy and peace, the feelings of anxiety, that none of these things could be communicated to another person. There was no way to know that, that thing that we call empathy doesn't exist in this world because I can't know what you're feeling. I can't then communicate to you, to encourage you, or there is nothing that we stand upon if this is our worldview. And as we go through this, you'll see why there's not a whole lot of people that hold to this worldview. I don't think there's a lot of nihilism evangelists. But notice here, as we continue to explore this topic of nihilism, basically nihilism denies the possibility of knowing the truth, rejects the possibility of absolute moral or ethical values, and it advocates for the destruction of all existing political, social, and religious orders. Wow. Basically, so nihilism is basically saying any notion of truth is necessarily false, and so our job, in order to maintain truth, in a sense, their truth of nothingness, we need to destroy all the powers that be. All of the order, everything needs to be deconstructed in order to get back to what's really true, and that is nothing. Okay, so then it goes on. It says, life has no intrinsic meaning or value. Wow. You know, we had a philosopher that looked into this phenomena of nihilism. He studied this. He looked into it probably too much. And he's the one that's famous. This is Friedrich Nietzsche. He's famous for penning those words, God is dead. Notice what he writes. He says, every belief, every considering something true is necessarily false because there is simply no true world. Now, isn't that interesting that the same person that penned the words, God is dead, is now penning the words that there is no truth. There's nothing to believe. There's nothing true. There's no true world. Could there be a connection between no God and no truth and no true world? And I am going to show you throughout this weekend that there is a very clear connection. The poor man, Friedrich Nietzsche, died at the age of 56 years old. He spent the last 11 years of his life in an insane asylum. And the closest thing that I can come to describing a world without truth is an insane asylum. No truth means insanity. No stable ethics, morality, rules, anything. Nihilism is like having a school without a school teacher, or having a game without rules. I mean, it doesn't offer any sort of purpose or value or meaning to anything that you're doing. Helmut Thielicke wrote this. He says, nihilism literally has only one truth to declare, namely that ultimately nothingness prevails and the world is meaningless. Shakespeare, somebody we're probably even much more familiar with, writes this. He says, out, out, brief candle. Life is but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So this is a world that is being honest with the approach or the belief that they have come from nothing. Because they logically progress that if we came from nothing, we're here for no reason and we're going nowhere. You know, in the Bible we find somebody that I'm sure we're all familiar with that struggled with this same concept, the same fear or the same dilemma of meaninglessness. And I want to take some time to look at what he says. We're all familiar with a man named Solomon, right? The wisest man that ever lived. He writes the book of Proverbs, which is full of all kinds of meaningful and truthful and wonderful proverbs, lessons that we can draw from. But he didn't only write the book of Proverbs, he also wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. And at this point in his life, Solomon had somehow been led astray by his passions, by his pride, by his affections for the things of this world, by his desires for success. All of these things somehow leads him away from his relationship with God. And he falls into a deep depression. And he starts to look at his life without God. Starts to look at what he has accomplished in this world without God. Notice what he writes. Ecclesiastes 1:2 says, vanity of vanities. Says the preacher, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. Do you know what that word vanity means? It's not spending too much time in front of the mirror. It means meaningless. Meaningless. Everything is meaningless. He writes in Ecclesiastes 2:1 and 2, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad. And of pleasure, what is it? You see, when you take away any sense of purpose, value, meaning, everything, what is left to live for? Pleasure, maybe? If there's no reason to do anything else, then at least you might gravitate towards those things that make you feel good. And so you can see that in Solomon's journey, he does exactly that. He goes out and he decides that he is just going to try to experience as much pleasure as he possibly can. And of course, we know, the Bible tells us that he had some 1,000 concubines or 1,000 wives. He had thousands of women that he could draw on at any moment of any day. And yet this was not fulfilling. He had all the food and all of the drink and all of the pleasures and the riches and all of these things. And yet, what does he say here? He says that even laughter and even all of these pleasures and everything, when you really look at it, with a world that has no meaning, a world that has no God, this too is meaningless. Ecclesiastes 2:15. Solomon tries to find meaning in some other part of life. Notice what it says. It says, "Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity." All right, so he looks at the fact that he is the wisest man in the world. He has all of this knowledge, all of this wisdom, and yet in a world without God, that too means nothing. I mean, how many people spend their whole lives becoming, first high school and then college graduate and then on to master's and doctorate and then another doctorate and yet when everything's said and done, they look back at everything that they've learned and accomplished and know, and they find no meaning, because without God there is no purpose, there is no meaning, there is no value. So even all of the knowledge doesn't fulfill that deep longing we have in our hearts for truth. Ecclesiastes 2:16 says, For of the wise as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. When we strip away the existence of God, the existence of truth, we see that all of these pursuits that we may have in our lives, things that we might put in our lives to bring some sense of purpose and value, when everything is said and done, they really offer nothing. They're meaningless. Which brings us to one of the most powerful verses in the Bible. It's a verse where Jesus describes his mission on earth. He describes why he left the pleasures and the comfort and the joy and the bliss of heaven and come down and walk and talk with us on planet Earth. There was something of such great value, a purpose that had such a great importance, that he was willing to come and do everything that he did for us, even to die on the cross. Let's see from his own mouth what that purpose was. John 18:37. Jesus says, "For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is in the truth, everyone who is of the truth, listens to my voice." So my question for you guys tonight is, are you of the truth? Do you have truth in your life? Because if you don't, that might be the reason that at times you feel a deep emptiness inside, a deep longing, a deep sense that something is not right. Jesus came to give you truth. Jesus was willing to sacrifice everything in order to come down and tell you that there is meaning, there is purpose, there is value for each and every one of us. We're going to ask another couple of questions as we go through our talks this series. So as we look at our world, we look at the possibility or what the world would look like without truth. We see that a society as we know it would disintegrate, that there would be no need for schools or churches or pastors or seminaries or any of these things, because there would be nothing to learn, nothing to preach as truth, nothing to discover for a scientist or to know as a philosopher, that this world would offer no meaning, purpose, value, or anything. And so when we look back at our world, when we look at reality, when we look around us, what do we see? We see that actually there are schools and there are churches and there is a justice system. We see that there's police and judges, and all of these things have all been put into place because we do have at least a concept of truth. And that the only reason that our society functions today is because people believe to some extent in the existence of truth. So we need to ask ourselves the question then, where did truth come from? And going back to our two possibilities, we really only have these two. Either truth came from nothing. In other words, somehow truth was invented. It didn't exist before, but somebody invented it. Or truth came from God. Either God exists and he has brought truth into our world, or he is the source of truth, or nothing is really there, and so our society, our world, our own thinking has invented the notion of truth. So which is it? Invented truth or eternal truth? Tomorrow night we're going to be looking at the question of whether or not truth can be invented, whether or not that's possible, and whether or not that is what has taken place. The following night we're going to look at eternal truth. How can we have certainty? How can we know for certainty that we have the correct understanding of truth? We'll then look at deception. Once we have understood what truth is, we need to understand how we can decipher between truth and error. And then the final night, the fifth night, Tuesday night, we're going to be looking at what decision you're going to make in your own life. Are you going to make truth your truth? Are you going to put your feet firmly on the rock of truth? Or are you going to live your life on the shifting sand of what we will be terming invented truth? So I hope to see you guys the next nights. Let's have a word of prayer together. Heavenly Father, thank you for your grace. Thank you for truth. Thank you for this opportunity to discover the importance of truth and to not just look at it as something that is abstract and far off, but to make that truth the foundation of our lives. Please bless us with the spirit of truth that has been promised so that it can lead us, so that your sweet spirit can lead us into all truth. Bless each one of us as we go through this series together. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.